Hi, this is Pastor Tim Delaney. I've teased up to this point that we're going to be kind of doing this year where as we walk through with a devotional setup of understanding the Bible. And so what I'm going to be doing is going to be focusing on different topics. Well, not so much topics, but each book of the Bible as we go. Depending on the length, we might jump a little ahead on some of that stuff. We might put a couple of them together, especially when we come to our 12 minor prophets, in which we'll talk just briefly on here very soon. But I hope you are excited as I am as we do this. But before we actually get into that, I'd like to invite you to join with me into a time of prayer. Gracious God, we thank you for this time together, that as we learn a little bit more about the Bible, as we kind of dive in a little bit more, I know that this time together will be brief, but it's just something for us to be able to still look forward to and have together. As we begin today with just a brief snippet about the Bible itself, but then we move into our first book of Genesis. And so open our hearts, open our minds, and open ourselves to hear what we have to hear today. And so we thank you for all this in your Son's holy name. Amen. So as I said, we're going to be going a little bit through a little bit of a snippet of just an introduction to a little bit of the Bible first. Because some of the big things to remember about with the Bible is that the Bible was written in a different time in a different place. But some of the key important things for us to understand first off is that the word Bible is derived through Latin from the Greek word biblia. And the Bible itself is made up of two testaments or covenants. And that's where we see the Greek word actually for testament that we actually transfer, that's called diatheke, which is covenants. And so some of the important things that we kind of look at and we gain from all this setup. And you'll kind of notice I'm going to be looking down a little bit and then looking back up, because I do have some notes that I want to make sure that I get like key parts to us. But as I said, the word Bible or Biblia can also mean the word for scriptures or the writings. It's some of the important things for us to gain and understand of all of that. And what's important for us also as we go about this is to see what that all entails and what that looks like. Because first off, as I said, the Bible is broken down into two parts: the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament is what we as Christians refer to it, but we actually borrow this from the Jewish people. And the Jewish people call this the Tanakh. And what that is that the Tanakh is broken down into three little sections. Honestly, I probably should have pulled up what are the proper terms for the Tanakh is in this, and which of course I can let you know on the first part, which is the law, is referred to as the Torah, or as we oftentimes will call it in Christian circles, the Pentateuch. And this is the first 5 books of the Bible. But the thing is, we're not going to get into that quite yet, because I'm going to break that down a little bit more here shortly. But as we can see, the Old Testament is broken down into 3 parts: what we call the law, the prophets, and the writings. And what we see within each of these, as I said, the law, the first part that we also know as the Pentateuch, includes the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers. And what we're going to be kind of seeing along the way is the reason why they're called the books of Moses is because, traditionally speaking, we believe that Moses wrote these. But we're going to dive into that shortly. We're not going to get hung up onto that right now at this moment, because the next part is called the prophets. And what we see here, we see what is known as the former prophets, which are the 4 that you see there on the left: Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And then, of course, we have what's known as the latter prophets. And these are ones that we see especially coming up during what is known as the Babylonian and the Assyrian exiles, the times where we had these massive empires that had swooped in and conquered and took over these places, or took over Israel, really. And so we have the 3 major prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. And then you'll see that we have our 12 minor prophets: Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. You'll notice that Daniel's missing from there, and what is oftentimes lumped in with Jeremiah, which is Lamentations, but we see that actually in what would be the third part, which is known as the writings, in which this of course includes our poetics like Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Songs of Solomon, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, Chronicles, Ruth, and we see this really big build up right here between those as they kind of go together with this. We see them very profoundly in this way. But of course, without looking to, or without it too much, we then have the New Testament. This is the second half that we see with our Christian Bibles. And this is broken down into 4 parts. We have the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, of course. The Acts of the Apostles, our written letters, and Revelation. And it's within these that we see the whole prophecy of taking place of things. And so I don't want to spend too much time on the Bible part itself because this is primarily on the book of Genesis. But the main message that we see from the Bible is the story of salvation. And we oftentimes see that in 3. You'll see 3 show up a lot, especially once we get into the New Testament side of things. But 3 tends to come up quite often when it comes to the Bible. Our first part that we see is the bringer of salvation. The way of salvation is that number 2. And then number 3, the heirs of salvation. And it's within this that we tend to see this central theme that goes on here. Now that we've had a chance to really stop and take a look at the Bible, just the Bible as a whole itself, we're now going to jump into the meat of that stuff. And so, of course, that means we're first going to be looking over the book of Genesis. As you can kind of see right there, it's the book of Genesis. Now, the authorship that comes into this is that it comes into 2 parts that we see with this. There's our traditional part. So traditionally, we see what is called the Toledot phrasing, in which this is what we see, this is the account of, and it ties into Moses, but we also see it tie into the other major figures, which we'll get to after a bit. The other one that we see is the whole divine revelation. And so this is where it is believed that God revealed the information to Moses. That all the stuff that had happened before Moses and all the stuff that had happened everything that had happened to before Moses, because there's a lot of time there that things could be lost in that time frame itself. So God bestowed this upon Moses. And so that's one of our other major correlations that go towards the traditional part. Our ancient records is the fact that is Moses during his later part of his life, especially after during the exile area, and they're building their way up to the promised land itself, is he may have collected all of this. Because remember, this is an oral tradition. For a long time, they were an oral tradition that are said from one person to the next. And so along the way, people may have had records. And especially since back in those days, it was a big deal when it came to who your genealogy was, in which we see a lot of that happens, especially in the book of Genesis. And the last one, of course, is the biblical testimony that other books cite Moses as the author of the Torah, the first 5. We see this throughout there. But then, of course, on the other side of things, we see the scholarly aspect of what would be our authorship here, in which this one falls more into the scholarly part, as it is so entitled. And so we have our first one, which is called the documentary hypothesis. And what this is that it is believed that there are 4 sources that actually played into the larger part of bringing this all together. And this include the Yahwist, the Elohist, the Deuteronomist, and the priestly. So these were outside sources that helped piece this stuff together. And with their different styles and vocabularies and theological perspectives, it allowed for a chance of multiple perspectives to tie into this, to bring this stuff all together, especially as we would see the book of Genesis. Another part that kind of focuses on the scholarly aspect compared to the traditional is that we have a tendency to see inconsistencies in here, in which right now that's not our focus about trying to figure out what those inconsistencies are. I'm just being informational on this part and bringing this out further to understand where we go from these different things. Another of these are source parts that we're looking at is what's called the anachronisms. And with this one, the text describes events after Moses' supposed life, even mentioning his death at the end of the Deuteronomy, which could be impossible for him to write. And so we actually see this situation of like, how could Moses have even known a lot of that stuff before his time? Remember, once more, they were an oral tradition, so we're seeing a lot of that here. And then, of course, also a focus is in that scholarly aspect of things is that there is no scriptural claim. And so what this is that the text itself, so we're looking at those first 5 books do not say anything specifically about Moses being the author. The closest that we see is actually near the end of, before Moses hands things over to Joshua. We see Moses recite to him, "Here's a song." We actually refer to it as the Song of Moses. It was a tradition that was to be passed along, given on to the people, to then be shared each year as a memory to what it is that the people had gone through, especially in what God has picked them up as this ragtag, motley group of people and moved them into what would become a much larger dynasty, you could say, especially as things would go. And so one of the big things that we also kind of run into is, so when was this stuff written? And so what we're seeing in some or in our resources is that it's believed that Genesis was written between 1446 and 1406 BC. And so that also leads into, so what kind of genre do we have that goes along with this? So Genesis, most of the books of the Bible, we can give them at least some type of genre. This book tends to be a little bit harder to do. And the reason for that is because we're seeing a wide variety. It's complex. We're seeing a vast variety. Everything from ancient Hebrew prose to narratives to primeval history, what is sometimes called antiquities, genealogical records, and prophetic material, blending in together with seen as some as myth and history. So, I mean, we're seeing a wide variety that comes together. So then, of course, what does that mean for our main theme and purpose of things? Well, the book of Genesis is beginnings that introduces several themes through that we will much later see. Remember, like I said, narratives, prose, we see antiquities, history, genealogy. I mean, this pretty much sets the foundation to what we're going to see in much later stories, in much later books of the Bible then. So, if we're going to sit and break down the book of Genesis, what would be an ultimate summary of what this looks like? Well, this is what I was able to come up with, with help from different sources. The first book of the Bible, narrating the creation of the world, fall of humanity from grace, and the early history of humanity. And so what we're seeing here is we're just seeing, and that's just the most I could get with just a very run-of-the-mill summary of things. Maybe you've been able to come up with other ones. So hey, if you can think of some other ones that you would like or that would be fitting in that, put them into the comment section. That would be amazing, and that would be great. So then, what does that mean for the book of Genesis itself? I mean, it's 50 chapters. It's a big book. But what's the best way to break it down to better understand it? Well, what I've been able to find is that it's best to put it down into 2 categories. What is our first one, which is chapters 1 through 11, known as primeval history. Our second part, which is we're looking at 12 through 50 then, and that's going to be our patriarchal history. And so what these all entail and looks like boils down to what this is. So, of course, our primeval history, this entails, of course, our creation story, the fall. Well, we're familiar with the whole Adam and Eve situation and how we hear of that. What that all builds up to, how humanity has continued to have problems up until we get to the time of Noah and the flood, in which God has looked upon the earth and has seen that, oh boy, okay, let's try something different here. And so we have the flood, and then, of course, that then builds up to what is the dispersation of the nations, or our Tower of Babel. And it's in this point that God then confuses all the people of that area, and they scatter to different places then. So with that in mind, actually I'm going to jump back for one moment because I do want to talk a little bit briefly about the patriarchal history part. But what we're seeing is that the main focus actually falls upon one man itself. His name is Abram. Just because we see the focus on Abram, who will one day become Abraham, does that mean that he's the main focus of this story? Because what we're seeing here is that we're very strongly seeing a male perspective are cast throughout this, as we see the 4 major figures here. First, of course, as I said, Abram, who God calls, becomes Abraham eventually, and tells him to leave his home and go out, and that one day his people will be made into a great nation. Then we, of course, see Isaac. And with Isaac, we see the whole promised son of Abraham. There was the unfortunate part, of course, when it came with Hagar and Ishmael, which we're going to get to after a bit, because we do want to see who some of the major figures are in this book, even though there's a long list. We then see Jacob, which of course we have the whole famous story of Jacob and Esau. Once again, we'll get into that a little bit more, but we see the fact that Jacob, whose name who will eventually be changed to Israel, would then be the father of the 12 tribes. So that's a big deal there. And then that wraps up with the patriarchal history of Joseph, who is one of Jacob's sons, who was sold into slavery and then sent out. And during that time, he raised the prominence and power in Egypt. And that is actually what transitions us into the next book of Exodus, which we'll actually hear about not really today, but in 2 weeks when we go into our book of Genesis then. So now, what does that mean for our thematic approach then? So what we see with our thematic approach, and what this means is the book itself can be broken down into themes, the overarching themes of this. And once more, hey, it's that 3 in there again. But what we're seeing with the 3 in here is that, of course, God's sovereignty, which consistently highlights God's control over events, even amidst human failure and sin. Number 2, as you see there, the covenant promise, in which one of the major focuses that we see with Isaiah or Jeremiah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and Hagar as well. We'll talk a little bit about her shortly. That is really important for us to hear about. But what we're seeing and hearing in all this falls upon the fact that God is oftentimes making a promise that I will be your God as you be my people. And remember, it's a two-way street. It's not just one. That's one of the key things that we see here. And then, of course, we see sin and redemption. One of the big things that we see throughout the Bible overall is the problem of sin. And we oftentimes see the fact that with that sin, God is usually the one that's in there that brings redemption, brings in that whole focus for new opportunities then. So now, we're going to focus on some of our key figures here. So it's not limited to just this group of people here. I strongly encourage you to take a chance to look at some of the bigger focuses, but these are some of the major ones that we see throughout the book of Genesis that are important for us to remember. First off, we have Adam and Eve. We see that from the beginning, where they were the first ones created, and it was through them that then sin entered the world, that we saw temptation, we saw the fall. So we have that major figure there. And then we have their children, Cain and Abel, which of course we see one of the first times of infighting, arguing over who knew the best way how to handle this stuff. Not the greatest, but definitely a lesson to be learned there. Then of course we have Noah. Noah is right there at that major figure about the whole creating or building the ark, where all of a sudden had all the different animals that came that taught us some really important things when it comes to being righteous in the eyes of the Lord. Next we have Abram and Sarah. I chose that name intentionally because that was their original names, and then as their covenant was made with God, they became Abraham and Sarah. Some of the major things that we see here is about Abraham once more being chosen to set right with the ways. Sarah has a whole situation where at first she's unable to conceive. She's unable to become pregnant, in which of course we see issues in there with when it comes to struggling in faith. I mean, that's one of those major things, because with both of these we see a struggle in faith. In fact, one of my favorite ones is with Abraham, because the fact that he struggles in his faith. He's told to get up and leave. I mean, they go to Egypt, and he pretty much tells Sarah, pretend that you're my sister, because otherwise they'll kill me to take you as their wife. I mean, he essentially dooms the entire kingdom of Egypt to death by God. But he's not the only one that's done this. I mean, this is a family trait that continues. But then, of course, they have Hagar that's in it. Hagar tends to get overlooked very often. She was the maidservant to Sarah. And when Sarah was frustrated with the fact that she could not bear children, she told Abraham to have a child with Hagar, and that way there would be an heir. Well, this is where we saw Ishmael, and Ishmael plays a bigger part in later parts of this, especially when Abraham would go down to rest, and that Ishmael would actually have 12 sons of his own, which would actually we see today with Islam and that stuff, in which of course they draw their name upon too in this case. But what we're going to see here is that Hagar played this major factor as also one of the only women to have a covenantal interaction with God. That is a big deal, in which as she was struggling not to watch her child die of starvation and water, God intervened and said that just as Ishmael is the son of Abraham, he will uphold his covenantal promise through Ishmael as well. And so we see that whole situation there. Next thing that we see on here is, of course, we see Isaac, of course, who is the child of Sarah, in which Sarah, who had given birth with Isaac, saw that Ishmael and Isaac were playing, told Abraham to kick Hagar and Ishmael out. That's a whole issue, and we see there. Well, after we see Isaac, who is born, Isaac is heir to the God. His story focuses on his relationship with Rebekah and what we see with the favoritism with his sons. Because one of the big things that we see with Isaac is that as much as we see a push and a transition of the story, it's his children, Jacob and Esau, that we see the major factor. Rebekah at one point plays a factor that we'll see much later as well. But what we see is the fact that we have Jacob and Esau. Esau and Jacob are twins. Esau's just slightly older because he came out first, but yet we see these two sons pretty much split the parents apart on this one. Rebekah prefers Jacob, and Isaac prefers Esau. The problem that we see in this is that all of a sudden we see them fighting. We see headbutting. We see the fact that Jacob steals the birthright of Esau by tricking him. I mean, go ahead and read the story yourself, but there's a lot of factors, and we can't exactly say shame on Jacob or even shame on Esau. There's an equal part on this, especially since this whole interaction of brothers is reflective with Cain and Abel. And actually, Jesus tells us a story about a parable, the prodigal son, in which we see hostilities between two brothers in that story as well. But we're not going to focus on that. That actually has nothing to do with this right now. But we then have Jacob, who would be renamed Israel after wrestling with God, and would birth the 12 nations of Israel. And not to name all of them on that part, but that leads into our story of Joseph, in which Joseph was seen as the blessed holy son of Rachel, who was the favorite of Jacob. Leah was kind of cast in a bad position on that one, but Rachel was always the favorite wife, and so that meant Joseph was the favorite son, the miracle child, as we would say. I mean, say what you want with our Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat. I mean, yeah, if Joseph's singing a song like that and rubbing into his brother's faces, I mean, I'd be feeling a little rough on that one myself. But what we're seeing here is that Joseph gets sold into slavery. And it's in that selling to slavery that he then learns his lesson about what it means to be arrogant, what it means to walk in the ways of God on this case. And so what we're seeing here is this whole situation build up of redemption. Remember what I said, one of the major themes that we see is sin and redemption. We see hostilities, we see anger, we see frustration, all emotions and feelings that we know all too well ourselves, but yet we see redemption that plays out in all of that. Some of the other key figures I didn't list that I realized I should have mentioned in here was also Lot and Jehoshaphat, and we have a number of others. Now as we kind of get this into a nutshell, because remember, I could spend a great deal more time talking about all this stuff, but that's not the point of this. This is to go over things, to talk about things, to look at this. In fact, this video is probably going to be a little bit longer than the ones to come, just because I spent that early part of it talking about the Bible itself. But The thing that are some of the key teachings and themes that we gained from this is, of course, the creation in God's image. Especially that key part of God's image, because that is something that we see Jesus, especially in our Christian faith, revolve around a lot. That we are creating God's image, so that means there's a sacred worth that's there. And it means all people are created in that way. Of course, we have the fall and sin in which God, or that humanity's choice to disobey God introduced sin, leading to alienation from God, but it leads to so much more than just our relationship with God, but our relationship with all the people around us as well. Because that's one of the key things about that fallen sin, because we're missing the mark there in our connections and relationships with other people. Another key teaching that we see is God's sovereignty and holiness, that God is the ultimate all-powerful creator, sovereignty over all things. But it's in that we also see a lot of troubles, is it then begs the big question of, if God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and created all things, does that mean that God is also the root of all evil? That's one of those things that tends to get asked, those questions out there. Not solving that question right now. That hopefully you'll be able to come to your own conclusion as we work our way through the Bible, as we work our way through this lesson set. Of course, our covenant and promise, that's a huge main theme, because God over and over makes these promises in fulfilling and helping out the people. So it's something that's really key and important for us as well. Grace and redemption, I mean, that itself, I would almost say, is like the foundation of what our faith is grace and redemption. That no matter how badly we mess up, God is always there. And that's something that we see in our lives today as well. Another thing is that we see, of course, our foundational narratives. Like this, the reason why Genesis plays such a major factor is because just how life has a beginning, Genesis sets the foundations of what would be the Jewish religion to the Christian religion, and how it's deeply ingrained and foundational in its relationship with God. I mean, Christianity is rooted in our relationship with God. I mean, just think about the 10 Commandments, which we'll look at in 2 weeks, but also what Jesus does in love God, love neighbor. I mean, it's rooted in that relationship there. And then, of course, more than anything, this book teaches us and shows us the importance of worship and sacrifice. What this means to approach God in a way of worship, to sacrifice oneself, to put ourselves out there. And sacrifice, I don't mean going out into a danger field or going and building a altar and killing an animal. What I mean, sacrificial sacrifices here is to make ourselves vulnerable to put ourselves before God, because that's one of the big things that we tend to overlook and forget at times. So, with all that together, all that stuff brought together, what is the conclusion that we have with the book of Genesis? At the end of the day, Genesis is about God's sovereignty, redemption, God's grace, God's redemption. I mean, it's all set in stone about how that God's love is something that we cannot understand. It's something that is entirely amazing and wonderful all at the same time. So how does that apply for us today? Well, one of the important things is to be able to learn from that history. I mean, I think George Tatiana says it best. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Not just Genesis, but all human history, everything throughout the Old Testament, is a reminder of how the people need to learn and not screw up anymore. I mean, Jesus oftentimes quotes the Old Testament. Jesus oftentimes looks back to lessons. A lot of his parables are reflective of stories that can be found within our Old Testament, or the Tanakh. But I mean, the Tanakh, Old Testament, whichever you want to call it, teaches us the importance of understanding what came before so we don't repeat that. Because honestly, that's one of the biggest problems that we face, is that the problems that we have, the choices that we make, the issues that happen in this world are not brand new. They might look a little different, but they're still just the same. Just as I've been told that the troubles we face don't repeat themselves. It's a ripple. It just gets bigger and bigger until you can stop it completely. That's the thing that Genesis teaches us, is that we see over and over that people make the same mistakes, and yet God is always present, though. That's where we see the grace, though. And we'll see that throughout the Old Testament and in the New Testament, that people are constantly making the same mistakes over and over and over, but yet God is always present there. That's the important thing. So what does that mean for us? So I hope you enjoyed this time. Like I said, as I'm looking at the clock, we're hitting 30 minutes with this thing, so it's going to be a lengthy watch. But I hope you appreciate what we've done through this, what is going on, because one of the amazing things that come from this is the fact that we can be so much more. The fact that there's so much opportunity for us. And this is just the start. We're just hitting the peak of this with Genesis. It's the whole tip of the iceberg thing. And so if you'd like any of my notes that I want to put out there, if you'd like any of my notes in regards to what I did and study with this, feel free to reach out to me on Facebook onto this, or to message us at Lodi United Methodist Church, and we would be happy to get those emailed to you, so that way you can see the source. That way you can see the sources, you can see the kind of work that I put into putting this together. Or if you would just like a copy of my notes that has a little bit more of the details in there, you're more than welcome to ask for that too. So I hope you have a good, blessed week. I look forward to, in 2 weeks, we're going to be jumping over into the book of Exodus then. So hopefully you enjoyed this time and have a great time, and I will talk to you later. But before that, let's pray our way out. Gracious God, learning is an opportunity that we tend to overlook sometimes. But be with us as we go about this time. Be with us in helping to make our minds, our hearts, our whole being open to your interpretation, to your showing of the word to us, and how it is that we can apply it to our lives. And so as we go about this, we thank you for all that you are and all that you do, through your Son and through the Holy Spirit, who lives, breathes, and walks with us. Amen. Amen, and hope, and you have yourself a good, blessed rest of the day.